Picture this. The White House is on fire, and the U.S. president is fleeing the Capitol. Sounds like a movie, but it really happened in 1814 during the War of 1812. And guess what sparked that war? Trade conflicts and national pride. Today, the U.S. and Canada aren't firing cannons at each other, but they have clashed over trade. So let's dive into this dramatic history and see what it can teach us about modern trade wars. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you love wild history tales, hit that like button. Quick question. Did you know the British literally burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812? Comment below if that surprised you, or if you already knew it. Now let's rewind to find out why that happened and how it connects to trade fights today. It's the early 1800s. The British Empire is bullying American commerce, boarding U.S. ships, seizing goods, and even kidnapping American sailors to serve in the Royal Navy. The U.S. is fed up with these insults. Britain is also fighting Napoleon in Europe and had slapped restrictions on American trade with France, basically saying, "Don't trade with our enemy." Imagine being an American merchant back then. Your business is strangled and your sailors are being snatched. Tensions were sky high. On top of that, many Americans suspected the British were stirring up Native American tribes on the frontier to block U.S. expansion. A group of congressmen called war hawks, like Henry Clay, shouted that defending America's honor might mean war. Former President Thomas Jefferson even boasted that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. He thought it'd be easy peasy to seize Canada from Britain. So in June 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain. The goals were a mix of protecting American rights, national pride, and yes, some Americans had an eye on Canada. But the nation was divided. New Englanders who traded with Britain generally opposed the war, while folks in the South and West were all for it. The war kicked off with American invasions of Canada that did not go as planned. Instead of a quick victory, U.S. forces were beaten back by British regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors defending their land. Jefferson's easy march turned into a fiasco. The U.S. did have some successes, like a naval victory on Lake Erie and the defeat of the Native Confederacy led by Tecumseh, but by 1814 things looked grim for America. That's when the British took the offensive. In August 1814, British troops sailed into Chesapeake Bay, marched on Washington, and burned down the Capitol and the White House. First Lady Dolly Madison famously rescued George Washington's portrait from the White House just before the British torched it. It was a shocking moment. The young United States saw its capital city occupied and set ablaze. Next, the British attacked Baltimore, but at Fort McHenry in Baltimore's harbor, American defenders held out through a fierce overnight bombardment on September 13th, 1814. In the morning, the U.S. flag was still flying over the fort, an incredible sight that moved Francis Scott Key to write a poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner. Yep, the national anthem was born from this battle. The British Navy gave up on Baltimore after that failure. By late 1814, both sides were tired of fighting. They met in Ghent, in today's Belgium, and negotiated a peace. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814, basically agreeing to end the war and restore things to how they were before. Impressment and trade restrictions, the issues that started the war, weren't even addressed in the treaty, but they faded away anyway because Britain defeated Napoleon, so those disputes became moot. In other words, the war ended in a stalemate. Neither side really won territory or got concessions. It was like, let's call it a draw. Ironically, one of the biggest American victories happened after the treaty. News traveled slowly. In January 1815, British forces attacked New Orleans, not knowing the war was over. General Andrew Jackson led a ragtag American army and crushed the British in the Battle of New Orleans, inflicting huge casualties. Americans hailed it as a great victory. When word of the win and the peace treaty hit the U.S., people celebrated like they'd won the whole war. Many Americans felt it was a second war of independence that proved the U.S. could stand up to Britain. It launched a wave of patriotism and made Jackson a national hero. For Canadians, who were on Britain's side, the war became a source of pride as well. They had defended Canada from multiple U.S. invasions. That memory helped form a distinct Canadian identity, separate from the U.S. So the War of 1812 had a complex legacy. It didn't really resolve the issues it began over, but it reshaped how Americans, Brits, and Canadians saw themselves. What does this 200-year-old conflict teach us about today? A lot, actually. Fast forward to modern times, the U.S. and Canada are close allies and trading partners, but they still butt heads over trade. Let's look at a recent flare-up, call it a trade war in quotes. In 2018, the U.S. government, under President Donald Trump, suddenly slapped high tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. The stated reason was national security, which felt like an insult to Canada, America's longtime friend. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was furious. He called the tariffs totally unacceptable. Canada retaliated within days, hitting back with tariffs on $12.6 billion worth of U.S. goods. They even targeted products like Kentucky bourbon and Wisconsin cheese to put political pressure on U.S. leaders. Suddenly, a peaceful trade relationship turned into a shouting match. Both countries dug in. That summer, at a G7 summit, Trump and Trudeau traded barbs. Trump even called Trudeau dishonest and weak in a tweet. It was an ugly moment in U.S. Canada relations, something we hadn't seen in decades. People were actually using the term trade war to describe the situation, and there was real worry about economic damage on both sides. So how did this standoff end? Through negotiation, just like in 1814. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico sat down and renegotiated their trade deal, NAFTA, during this tension. By late 2018, they agreed on a new pact called USMCA, and by May 2019, the U.S. removed those steel and aluminum tariffs, and Canada dropped its retaliatory tariffs. Crisis averted. But not before both economies took a hit. The tariffs disrupted supply chains and raised costs for industries in each country. Studies found that the trade war didn't even achieve its main goals. It didn't significantly boost U.S. manufacturing jobs or fix trade deficits. It was a lose-lose, much like how the War of 1812 hurt both nations and resolved little. The parallels are striking. In 1812, a trade dispute escalated into an actual war that neither side really won. In 2018, trade disagreements led to a mini-economic war. Again, nobody truly won. History shows that economic conflicts can spiral if pride and anger take over. The War of 1812 teaches us that it's better to find a diplomatic solution early than to let conflicts blow up. After all, the U.S. and Britain ended up negotiating a peace without resolving the original trade issues directly. Those got solved by circumstances. U.S. tariffs on Canada 2025, latest developments. In early 2025, the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian imports, marking a sharp escalation in trade tensions. Effective March 4th, virtually all goods from Canada now face a 25% import tariff, with a lower 10% rate for Canadian energy and critical minerals like aluminum and uranium. The U.S. government framed these tariffs as a response to a national emergency related to illegal immigration and fentanyl drug trafficking. President Donald Trump argued that America must use its economic leverage for security, noting that other countries have used tariffs against the U.S. for decades, and now it is America's turn. These tariffs broadly impact industries ranging from agriculture and food to autos, manufacturing, and raw materials. The White House justified this hardline measure as necessary to protect Americans and pressure Canada to curb illicit cross-border flows. The move effectively suspended the tariff-free benefits of the USMCA, the U.S. Canada-Mexico Trade Pact for Canada, sparking a significant trade confrontation between the longtime allies. Economic impact. Prices, businesses, and jobs. North American supply chains are already feeling the strain, with long lines of trucks at border crossings, illustrating potential shipping delays and rising costs. Consumers are bracing for price hikes as the tariffs act like a tax on imported goods. Retailers have warned they will need to increase prices on everyday items, with one major U.S. retailer stating that certain grocery items, such as avocados from Mexico, will see immediate markups. Analysts estimate that the tariffs could cost the average American household nearly $1,000 per year in higher prices. Canadian shoppers will also feel the impact, as many U.S. products, from groceries to electronics, now carry a 25% surcharge upon entering Canada. Businesses that rely on cross-border trade are already facing significant challenges. Manufacturers, particularly in the auto industry, are dealing with steep cost increases and potential part shortages. In Windsor, Ontario, a key Canadian auto hub, officials have warned that a 25% tariff on automotive parts could be catastrophic for the entire industry, potentially forcing assembly line shutdowns within days. Companies on both sides of the border are scrambling to adjust supply chains or seek tariff exemptions. Some U.S. firms may delay investments or shift sourcing to avoid the tariffs, while Canadian exporters risk losing their competitive edge in their largest market. Early economic data and forecasts are flashing warning signs. Economists predict that the tariffs will drag down growth and employment in both countries. Canada, which sends about 75% of its exports to the U.S., faces the risk of an economic downturn, with some analysts warning that the country could slip into a recession by the second quarter of 2025. Unemployment rates could rise from 6.6% to around 8% if the trade conflict persists. The Bank of Canada has cautioned that prolonged tariffs will stunt growth and spike inflation. In the U.S., the ripple effects are also negative, with higher import costs expected to trim GDP growth by roughly 0.25 to 0.3 percentage points in the near term. One real-time GDP model swung from forecasting 2.3% growth to a 2.8% contraction for the first quarter of 2025 following the tariff implementation. Job losses are also a growing concern, with estimates indicating that over 170,000 U.S. jobs could be lost under the 25% tariffs, potentially exceeding 400,000 if Canada retaliates fully. Sectors such as agriculture, autos, and machinery, which are heavily dependent on Canadian trade, are at risk of layoffs and production cuts. The tariff decision has triggered a major political fallout between leaders of both countries. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reacted with sharp criticism, telling President Trump that the tariffs on Canada were a very dumb thing to do. He dismissed the U.S. rationale, blaming Canada for illegal fentanyl and migrant flows, as completely false, pointing out that less than 1% of U.S.-seized fentanyl originates in Canada. Trudeau accused Trump of attempting to damage the Canadian economy and vowed that Canada would not back down. He announced that Canada would challenge the U.S. tariffs through legal channels under the WTO and the USMCA dispute resolution mechanism. Canadian officials at all levels described the U.S. action as an assault on a close ally, with one provincial premier calling it a declaration of economic war. In Washington, President Trump remained firm despite the backlash. In a televised address to Congress, he hailed the tariffs as a necessary step to put Americans' safety and national security first. He linked Canada, along with Mexico and China, to the fentanyl crisis and argued that access to the U.S. market is a privilege. Trump warned that if U.S. trading partners retaliated, he was prepared to impose even higher tariffs. When Canada unveiled countermeasures, Trump responded combatively, threatening reciprocal tariffs of equal size. His remarks, including referring to Trudeau as the Governor of Canada, underscored the increasingly hostile nature of the dispute. Despite domestic pushback from some American lawmakers who worry about the tariffs' impact on farmers and manufacturers, the Trump administration maintains that Canada must make concessions on border security before any tariffs are lifted. Public reaction to the U.S. Canada tariff battle has been intense on both sides of the border. In the United States, polls indicate that a majority of Americans oppose tariffs on Canada, with only 28% in favor. Even among those who support tariffs in general, many believe taxing a friendly neighbor is counterproductive. Industry groups from retailers to auto manufacturers have voiced strong opposition, warning that American families and workers will bear the brunt of the economic fallout. In Canada, the public mood has been one of anger and defiance. Canadians across the political spectrum have rallied around the federal government's response. Trudeau urged citizens to support domestic products and avoid American goods where possible. This grassroots boycott gained traction, with Canadian consumers shunning U.S. orange juice, bourbon, and other targeted products. Some liquor stores even pulled American-made wines and spirits from their shelves in protest. While there is national pride in standing firm against U.S. economic aggression, many Canadians are also anxious about potential job losses and price hikes. Canada swiftly responded with its own counter tariffs, imposing a 25% duty on $30 billion, $21 billion US worth of U.S. imports effective March 4th. This retaliation targeted politically sensitive American industries, including Florida orange juice, California wine, Kentucky bourbon, peanut butter, beer, cosmetics, appliances, and apparel. If the trade war continues, Canada plans to escalate tariffs to an additional $125 billion, potentially covering passenger vehicles, steel, aluminum, fruits, vegetables, aerospace products, beef, pork, and dairy. Trudeau warned that Canada would broaden its tariffs to nearly all U.S. exports unless the U.S. reverses its actions. Beyond tariffs, Canada has launched challenges under the WTO and USMCA, arguing that the U.S. measures violate international trade rules. Domestically, the Canadian government is rolling out support for affected industries and workers, including emergency financial aid, expanded unemployment benefits, and tariff rebates for businesses struggling with increased costs. Some provincial governments have taken symbolic actions, such as banning U.S. liquor from stores and doubling tolls for American trucks. Broader trade implications and global concerns. The U.S. tariffs on Canada, along with similar actions against Mexico and China, have raised broader concerns about trade disruption. Mexico has vowed to retaliate, with expected tariffs on American agricultural products. The integrated North American economy, built over decades of free trade, is now under severe strain. Global financial markets reacted negatively, with stocks tumbling due to fears of escalating trade wars. The dispute also raises concerns about the long-term stability of trade relationships. Canada and Mexico are already seeking to diversify their trade partners, strengthening ties with Europe and Asia to reduce dependence on the U.S. If American suppliers become unreliable due to sudden tariffs, Canadian and Mexican firms may pivot towards Chinese and European competitors. Additionally, Canada's legal challenge at the WTO could test the limits of U.S. trade policies based on national security claims. The ongoing trade conflict between the U.S. and Canada has the potential to reshape North American economic ties and global trade dynamics. As both nations dig in their heels, the situation remains fluid, with significant consequences for businesses, consumers, and economic growth on both sides of the border. Another lesson? Nobody wins a trade war. In 1812, both countries' economies suffered. The British blockade hurt America. Losing U.S. trade hurt Britain. In 2018, both countries' businesses and consumers felt the pain of tariffs. When the dust settled, things went back to almost the same as before, just like in 1815. So what do you think? Are today's tariff battles worth it, or should countries remember lessons from history and find a better way? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through history and its connection to today, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where we learn from the past. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.